Hi, I am Don Blackwell. I am the Executive Director of the Gospel Broadcasting Network. Welcome to this episode of Truth on Wheels. Today I have with me Aaron Gallagher. You know Aaron, he is a regular at the Gospel Broadcasting Network. He's probably best known for his program, the Authentic Christian Podcast. It's a very popular program we have at GBN. If you haven't seen it, search it on YouTube or on Facebook. And you will enjoy that series they have. Have you just finished this season?
Well, yeah, we finished filming it. It's being released. And I always tell people if they need something to help them fall asleep at night, just put the podcast on.
Well, that's not true. But in this particular program, we're going to be discussing something that is very, very relevant in the world in which we live. And this is probably going to be a two-parter because there's so much material. We're going to be talking about homosexuality, gay marriage, transgender, LGBTQ+, and things of this nature. You might group it all in the category of gender identity disorder. And these things are all around us. We see them every day. We're literally being bombarded by this today, aren't we, Aaron?
Yeah, every day. I mean, before we started filming, I was just looking up earlier this year, we talked prior about the Boy Scouts of America.
Yeah.
And you'd said in one of your lessons that I'd listened to in preparation about how there'd been 82,000 cases of abuse. And I heard that and thought, I can't be right. I want to fact check that. So I looked it up. And what I found was an article from earlier this year, the Supreme Court in February had allowed the settlement to go forward for $2.5 billion with over, in the article, 82,000 former Boy Scouts who'd been abused.
Yeah, the number is so staggering, it makes you think that can't be true.
Yeah.
Of course, it wasn't that long back. Disney began making an all-out assault on the nation with regard to homosexuality. Our country has now assigned June as Pride Month. And I think it was in 2021, Disney, in cooperation with Pride Month, they had released that year their Buzz Lightyear story. And they had the first same-sex couple kissing in that type of, whatever you call that type of animation in that series. And in an interview with Carrie Burke, who at that time was the president of Disney's General Entertainment, she said this: "It is Disney's intention to feature many, many, many lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual characters in its films and programs. By the end of the year," she said, half of Disney's characters should be LGBTQIA or racially diverse. That is, they're going to be various nationalities, nothing wrong with that, or they're going to be involved in this various sexual perversion. She went on to say, "I'm here as a mother of two queer children, actually." She said one is a transgender child and the other is a pansexual child. Now, after she said that, there was so much pushback. She went on in her statement basically to say that we don't even have to hide it anymore. People are comfortable with this, and we don't hide it. We're just going to be open about it. Well, there ended up being pushback. My understanding was she lost her job, but Disney has not stopped being pro-homosexual.
Yeah.
And so we see that all around us. The Methodist Church, of course. Have you read anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember what year it was initially where they had the vote to basically decide whether they were going to allow homosexual pastors in weddings and all that. And then I don't know when they just missed it the first time, and then recently, a couple of years ago, they passed it. Is that right?
Yeah, they passed it, and they've been tied up in court battles trying to divide up their assets. So there is now a gay Methodist church and a straight Methodist church. I read an article dated June 8th, 2022 that said USA Mennonites vote to approve same-sex marriage. That blew my mind. The Mennonites are approving same-sex marriage. ReligionNews.com, I ran across an article, notable Christians who've had a change of heart on the LGBT issue, and it goes on to list all of these people, prominent denominational Christians, who in the last few years have changed their stance, and they say they've run across new things that have caused them to reevaluate. What do you think those new things would be?
Well, I'm sure they're just argument, like on Answer in the Air that we do together. the first time you hear some of these arguments, Matthew Vine's God and the Gay Christian, the video we reviewed, first time you hear some of these arguments like the Ezekiel, Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed not for the homosexuality, the abomination of that, but for inhospitality.
Right.
I think a lot of these people have never heard the arguments before.
Yeah.
And maybe they're presented in a very smooth way to them and they don't have a response.
That's right.
And then I also think there's the ones that just sort of bow to the cultural pressure.
Yeah.
If you don't go along with the rest of us, we'll ostracize you. The cancel culture, if you're a very popular author, even a religious author, if you don't kowtow sort of to the agenda, then, there'll be consequences for it.
Sure. I read an article online that said San Antonio City Council, San Antonio, Texas, had voted to remove Chick-fil-A from their airport. And I thought, everybody loves Chick-fil-A. Why'd they remove Chick-fil-A? Well, you guessed it. Chick-fil-A opposed homosexuality, and they've even kind of caved on this a bit. But because of that, they removed them from the airport. This is just a sampling to show we can go on and on and on. We are being bombarded by homosexuality on a daily basis. Young people are being brainwashed. Older people are being bullied and boycotted. And it's on TV all around us. Almost every program you watch, any new program, has a homosexual. I've heard people say, well, if it's on there, I turn it off. You can't even watch commercials anymore because it is it's on everything. Now, my question would be, this brainwashing, is it working?
I mean, I think you could look at the statistics and see that I think in one level it is. I mean, if you look, I read a poll recently that said of the Gen Z generation, that 20% of them, 1 out of 5, identify as something in that spectrum of LGBTQIA. I think there's a lot of factors to that, which we'll get into. Yeah. I think there's also a factor of attention. There's always in any culture, there's the compulsion for somebody to go along with something that will get them, in our culture, likes, follows, subscribers. And so if a lot of people in the world, not in a Christian community, but in the world, if you come out as trans, there's a lot of people who I think have good intentions, but they say like, oh, I want to affirm this person. I want to show them that I love them. And so they give them positive attention. And that in turn feeds sort of the machine of, acceptance for that person who wants the attention.
Yeah.
But I think that some of the brainwashing has been working. You talk about Disney. I mean, whether it's Disney or these other programs or movies, every single show, it doesn't matter if it's set in the, 1st century AD, a Roman show, they almost always, Hollywood finds a way to introduce this. And it's really, the goal is really to normalize it.
Sure.
So that when you see it, you think, oh, I'm used to that. It's not as big of a deal, as the Bible, of course, would describe it.
I saw on GazetteNet.com that to illustrate how this is working. In 1988, I was in high school then, support for gay marriage, it says support for gay marriage was 11%. I kind of have a hard time believing that. I live in a conservative area. I did not know a gay person. I don't believe it was that much where I was, but at least for the nation as a whole, they say that support was 11%. In 2021, Gallup says support was 70%.
Yeah.
So it went from 11% to 70% in a relatively short amount of time, a little more than 30 years. It's working. This bullying is working. The latest stat that I have says 84% of young people support gay marriage, 72% of middle-aged people, 60% of older people favor same-sex marriage, and they broke it down by political party. 83% of Democrats support gay marriage, 73% of independents, and even the Republican Party now, the majority of them, 55% of Republicans support gay marriage. And so I think you have to say the bullying and the normalization, as you say it, it's been working.
Is that a Gallup poll? Do you remember? Because
Which one?
When you started talking about the 71%.
Yeah, it's a Gallup.
Okay, I have a lesson I've done that I pulled up as you were going. And yeah, in June of 2022, 71%. And that poll said this: Americans who report that they attend church weekly remain the primary demographic holdout against gay marriage. Listen to this, with 40% in favor and 58% opposed. So it basically says what's holding out against the country almost fully approving it is people that go to church every week. And of those people that go to church every week, 4 out of 10 still approve of it.
Now, what about this question? We think about the Lord's church. Has the Lord's church been affected by this?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I can think of instances where we've made posts or episodes on, posts on Instagram or podcast episodes where, I think we're trying to be tactful and we're trying to be loving and say, look, I don't have any hate for these people in my heart. In fact, with some of the things we'll talk about in the next few episodes, I love and feel compassion towards them with some of the things that they may have experienced based off some of the science. But at the same time, it seems like anytime you do a lesson, you get a certain portion of people who, even members of the Lord's church, that sort of attack you and act like you're not supposed to talk about these things. And
sure. In fact, I wouldn't want to say that to anyone who's watching. Our focus in all of this is to reach and convert these people and to teach them that a person can change, they can become a Christian, they can go to heaven, and we're not going to get to that to the end. And so if a person only watches the first portion of this, I don't want them to get a skewed view about this. So what's the point in all the introduction? The point is we've got to talk about this. We have got to teach about it. We've got to preach about it. We've got to be strong. We've got to be regular. We've got to look at the arguments that are being made. We've got to review it. We've got to teach the people in the pews, and especially our young people, how to defend against these things. And I'm afraid that sometimes we just shy away from it. We don't want to talk about it. And when that's the case, when a person hears an argument in favor, they might be like these people who say, wow, we found some new material we didn't know, and we're convinced after all.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I sat down at one point and I started collecting articles or posts that I'd seen made on social media in defense of this type of thing.
Sure.
And I wanted us to review these, and we're going to go through these in kind of a broad stroke, and we could say a lot more about every one of these. But one of the things that I saw, the first statement is, this particularly related to gay marriage.
Sure.
In 2015, June of 2015, gay marriage was legalized by the Supreme Court. And at that point, it just created a storm of social media about this. And this is something that goes even back to then. I remember seeing people say, why are some of you so upset about this? All sins are the same in the eyes of God. You're trying to act like this is just worse than anything else. All sins are the same. No sin is worse than another. First, I'm not really sure where that comes from because the Bible doesn't teach that. I've heard people say that my whole life, but I guess I do know where it comes from. It comes from the idea that any sin can cause a man to be lost.
Yeah.
But it is not the case that God views all sins the same. And many passages teach that. Is there any that come to your mind? I've got a list that I've got in my notes.
The first one that I flipped to, I was in John 8 for a different reason, but John 19:11, whenever Jesus is delivered to Pilate, in John chapter 19 and verse 10, Pilate said, "Are you not speaking to me?" Pilate says to Jesus, "Do you not know I have power to crucify you and power to release you?" He's trying to sort of flex his might to Jesus, not really realizing who he's talking to.
Right.
And Jesus in John 19:11 says, Jesus answered, "You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin."
The greater sin.
So you know this, but throughout the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament, over and over, the Bible talks about greater sins or sins of ignorance versus presumptuous sins, that sort of idea.
We could stop right there and see not all sins are the same. Some sins are greater, some sins are lesser. I'll hit some very quickly to make the point. 2 Timothy 3:13, but evil men and impostors grow worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. If all sins are equal, how do you grow worse?
Yeah.
There's just a level. You'd remain the same. You just alluded to this from Psalm 19. The King James Version discusses what it calls secret and presumptuous sins. And that's really not the best translation in our modern language. It means sins of ignorance and sins of full knowledge. If you commit a sin of ignorance, it's still a sin. But if you commit a sin knowing it's a sin, in essence, you're shaking your fist in the face of God and saying, I'm going to do what I want to do.
Yeah.
In Psalm 19:13, the Lord refers to that type of sin as the great transgression. The point being, that's worse. A sin of ignorance is a sin, but if you know better and you do, we get that with our own children, don't we?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, if you've got 3 little children,
3 little kids.
and if one of your children does something by accident, you would say, "Son, don't do that."
Yeah. And that's the tone I normally say it in too. When they do something that I know that they don't realize they weren't supposed to do, I'll be like, "Hey, buddy, don't do that."
Right.
But whenever I say, "Hey, don't do this," and they're old enough to know better, and they continue to do it, then you're right. It's a completely different.
It's completely,
aspect,
and it's different with God.
Yeah.
Proverbs 6:16. These 6 things that the Lord hate, yea, 7 are an abomination to him. If God views all sins the same, then what's the point of that passage?
Yeah.
The point of this passage is here are some sins that are particularly offensive. They're high-level sins.
Yeah.
Exodus 32, Moses is up on the mountain. He's receiving the 10 Commandments. He comes down from the base of the mountain, and what's he find?
Golden calf.
The golden calf. They're making the golden calf, and they were saying, "You're the God who brought us out of Egypt." In Exodus 32:21, he asked Aaron, Moses turns to Aaron, and he says, "How have you brought so great a sin upon the people?" That is, Aaron, that's way up here. This is serious.
Yeah.
Not all sins are the same.
Yeah.
I'll mention 1 or 2 more. This could be a whole sermon. Sure. 2 Peter 2:20 talks about a person who obeys the gospel. He becomes a Christian. He leaves his past life, but then he goes back into it. The Bible says the latter end is worse with him than the beginning. Well, why would the latter end be worse if all sins are the same? Why would God treat one worse than another if he views all things the same? It doesn't logically follow.
Yeah.
And I'll hit one more. 1 Timothy 5:8, if any provide not for his own, especially those of his own household, he's denied the faith, and he's exactly the same as an infidel, right?
Worse than an unbeliever.
He's worse. We could go on and on. The Bible is filled with passages that teach that not all sins are the same. I give this illustration. Who would believe that God would look down from heaven and see someone running a red light and someone else sexually abusing a child and say, those are the same to me?
Yeah.
Are those the same to you?
No.
Not the same to me.
Yeah, and Jesus even said, Matthew 19:18, you might remember, but he said, whoever causes one of these little ones to sin, it would be better if he had a millstone tied around his neck and he was tossed into the depths of the ocean.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, that shows you, how much Jesus cared for children and those who would put a stumbling block or abuse children. That's a big deal to God.
That's right. That's very, very, very true. Luke 17.
That's right. 17.
All right, let's go to the second point. A second thing that I've seen people say is, well, homosexuals, they're not hurting anybody. So why do you have to oppose them? Just leave these people alone and let them live their life. They are not hurting you, so just mind your own business. What do you say to that? What do you think about this defense?
I mean, I would say if you believe that the Bible is the Word of God, which we do, and if someone doesn't, that's a different discussion. But if you believe that the Bible is the Word of God, that it has marks, that it came from a divine being, which it does, and the Bible did, then you have to think about what the Bible says about what sin does.
Mm-hmm.
I think about in Proverbs chapter 14, is it 34?
Yeah,
14:34 says, righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. So any sin, homosexuality or another sin, when you have a group of people who are engaging in something that's sinful, it's not good for the nation. Right. You could look at plenty of cases where homosexuals have directly affected somebody, but you could also make the greater case for indirectly when you have a group of people who are engaging in these lusts that don't benefit anybody.
Yeah.
That's going to lead the nation down a negative path. And I think you could look at America and see the effect just from the Gallup poll.
Sure.
Of the fact from, the 2000s, I think it was when that started. I don't remember, but how it's up to 70. The amount of approval of something that has had, and I'll say this, what you said earlier, even if you don't agree with the Bible, if you can, bear with us, because we're going to look at some statistics later that show that this movement is not healthy for those people. Even take the religious aspect out of the way, the mental health, the suicide rates, those all show you that they not only could be hurting others, but they're absolutely hurting themselves, even if they might not recognize it.
And if you think about particularly homosexuality as it relates to gay marriage, that is an attack on the very foundation of the home.
Yeah.
The country's made up of units that are homes.
Yeah.
And so righteousness exalts a nation, but sin is a reproach to any people. Now, you mentioned some statistics, so let's talk about that for a minute.
Sure.
A 2005 report found that a number of studies performed over a period spanning more than half a century, many of which were actually performed by homosexuals, have shown that an extremely large percentage of sexually active homosexuals also participate in child sexual molestation. Now, the indication of that is a homosexual is more likely to molest children. Now, I know that's a strong statement. I know that it is an inflammatory statement in some ways. Somebody might say, where did you find such a thing as this? The Nebraska Medical Journal said that when data from both genders is combined, homosexuals are 8 to 12 times more likely to molest children than are heterosexuals. And I found the source to this because somebody challenged me on it and said, no, that's not a legitimate thing. And you mentioned the Boy Scouts. Let's talk about that for just a minute.
Yeah, I don't remember exactly what year it was, but I'd heard you mention the lesson, and so I'd done some research. You might have some more information, but the Boy Scouts at a certain year, they started to allow, was it homosexual?
Well,
yeah.
This started right after when the Supreme Court made their ruling
2015.
in June of 2015. Right after that, the Boy Scouts followed suit.
Okay.
So it was in 2015. They said it was a 45 to 12 vote, and it ended the ban on homosexual scout leaders.
Yeah.
And then when you fast forward to February of 2020, the Boy Scouts had declared bankruptcy after multiple sex abuse lawsuits were filed against them. The number that I last had seen, it had surpassed 82,000, and I didn't know the information that you'd looked up today.
Yeah, well, when I heard you mention 82,000, I thought I got to check that myself, because that's the kind of statement, like you said, if you're going to make a statement like that in a sermon in front of a couple hundred people or on a program that's going to go on the internet in front of thousands, you better make sure that you have science to back it up.
Yeah.
And so I looked it up, and I actually found an article from earlier this year where the Supreme Court was basically allowing the $2.5 billion settlement to continue.
Yeah.
And I looked, and as I read the article, it said that there were 82,000 people in that class action lawsuit. So that's 82,000 who were involved in suing the Boy Scouts. I would have to think, just using common sense, that there were some who had been abused that didn't sue.
Yeah.
So
no doubt, because there's a shame.
Yeah.
They don't want to bring it up. They don't want to be a part of it.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
I would suspect the number's much higher than that.
I would think so.
So the point being, when people say, well, homosexuals are not hurting anyone, just mind your own business, that's not true. It's just not true.
Well, I mean, if you look at the CDC, I want to say 2022, but it was in the last 4 or 5 years. They came out with some statistics for the LGBTQ. LGBTQ means lesbian, gay, LGBT, bi, T, trans, LGBT. Q is queer or questioning.
Yeah.
And then I is intersex, which used to be called hermaphrodite. Intersex is the modern term. And then asexual, and the plus means, I read a journal done by medical doctors. It was written by a medical doctor, reviewed by a medical doctor. It had 72 genders. So there's a whole lot. They're not all worth studying, because a lot of them, the definitions, I read all of them. Some of them are similar. Mm-hmm. But when you look at the statistics, the CDC came out with a stat. They said that they're 4 times as likely to commit suicide, to attempt suicide.
Yeah.
There were 41% considered suicide last year. And if they're transgender or non-binary, which is somebody that says I'm neither male nor female, it said that 50% of them have contemplated or attempted suicide.
That means half of everyone that you meet
have thought or tried to kill themselves. If you don't even believe the Bible, you should care about, I care about these people. Even if I would say I think their lifestyle is harmful to themselves and spiritually, that it's sinful. Even if you take that aspect out of it, if you have a son or a daughter or a friend or a coworker and you see this in their life, the statistics from the CDC, not from the Gospel Broadcasting Network, but from a secular society like the CDC, they say that almost half of them have wanted to kill themselves. That's
But Aaron,
awful.
you know what they would say. They would say the reason they've wanted to kill themselves is because radical Christians who've opposed them and because society will not accept them. That's what they would attribute it to.
You're right. And I would say, if anyone wants to read, there's a lengthy study. It's not that lengthy. It depends on how long you think. There's a study that came out in a journal called The New Atlantis. The study is about 118 pages long. It's free on the internet. But there was a man named Lawrence Mayer, and he's highly credentialed. He taught at Princeton. He's been tenured for 40 years at Princeton and University of Pennsylvania and Michigan and Arizona State, Johns Hopkins, all these big Ivy League schools. Many of those are Ivy League. And one of his, I think his name was McHugh, one of the director of Johns Hopkins psychiatry department, asked him to look into some information. And as this man looked into this information, he sort of saw the stats for depression, mental health in the LGBTQ community. And so that sort of sent him on a mission for him to look into this information. And in this 118-page study, it's called Gender and Gender Sexuality, I believe. Let me see. Sexuality and Gender. It was published in the New Atlantis Journal of Technology and Culture. Lawrence A. Mayer, he basically loved the LGBT. He dedicated his study to the LGBTQ community that he loved, and that he had been an expert witness in federal and state court supporting this community. So he loves these people. And he looked at this, and he actually looked at the cause. And in part of that study, he examined many things. But one of the things he looked at was what's called the etiology. Etiology is from two Greek words. A-I-T-I-A is a transliteration, ita, cause, and logos, word or study. So the study of what causes something. Because you're right. And I say all that to say this. What they'll say is, yes, the LGBTQ community has higher frequencies of mental health and depression. But they will say the only reason is because Christians and other people treat them poorly, therefore they're depressed. And he looked at that in this study, and he said that he looked at 500 studies, every study that had been done on sexuality and gender. And he said that there's no science to show that the idea of them becoming depressed stems from persecution. Now, I don't doubt that happens, that they're persecuted more.
Sure.
Because they're abnormal in the society. But what he said is there's no evidence to prove that that's what causes that. And what there actually is evidence to prove is that childhood trauma is what causes the other way around.
I think
it's a 118-page study. It's gonna be. I can't summarize all of it in 1 or 2 episodes. I would encourage anybody that wants to read it for themselves, reach out to us. We'll give you the link.
Yeah, in fact, we'll put the link below so that you can click on it and go directly to it.
Yeah.
What'd be interesting? Support for this has greatly been increasing. It's been on the rise. It would be interesting to see a correlation. If the reason for the 50% suicide or thoughts of suicide relates to opposition, we should see that declining because opposition
it's becoming more accepted.
Yeah, it's becoming more and more accepted. So the suicide should be declining, but I bet you would not see that correlation.
Yeah. In that study, I have a couple quotes that I'll read, but he's highly credentialed. He even said that when he was asked to examine this information by his coworker, Paul McHugh, who's the chief of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins, and this led him to get on this rabbit hole. These are some of the things he found. He said, number one, this report is not about moral, religious, political, or philosophical agenda. He's not doing it from that. He said his research was dedicated to science, medicine, and truth, right? And so this is what he found in his study. He said, in both males and females, significantly, and I'm quoting him, higher rates of non-heterosexuality were found in participants who experienced childhood sexual abuse and in those with a risky childhood family environment. So not just sexual abuse, but psychological abuse or physical abuse.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's hold that thought because that leads in very nicely to this third one.
Okay, great.
That is the third thing I was going to bring up that I've seen on social media is people have said, well, if people have these issues, LGBT, homosexuality, transgender, it's because God made them that way. They were born that way. Now, we could argue this biblically. We could argue this scientifically.
Yeah.
Since you've already started down this discussion, let's argue it scientifically.
Sure.
based on what he's saying, is there scientific evidence for the fact that you are born that way?
Yeah, the Lady Gaga song, I Was Born This Way. That's sort of the idea. They mapped the human genome years ago, and they said they were going to find a gay gene. They didn't.
Yeah.
In this study, which I would encourage anybody, don't take my word for it. My degree is in biology, but I'm not a PhD endocrinologist, right? So, or a psychiatrist. So I would say if you don't, just go read this study for yourself, right? But one of the things he looked at in this study, that's one of the aspects, are people born this way? And I'm trying to look down through some of these quotes that he said. He said this. This is some of his conclusions. After examining, he said, over 500 studies. So all of the literature out there, he's the guy that would review it all. He said this: the understanding of sexual orientation as an innate, biologically fixed property of human beings, the idea that people are born that way, is not supported by scientific evidence. He then said this: one study estimated that as many as 80% of male adolescents, young people, who report some same-sex attraction as they grow into adulthood, it goes away. And then he said this: the hypothesis that gender identity is an innate, fixed property of human beings that is independent of biological sex, that a person might be a man trapped in a woman's body or a woman trapped in a man's body, is not supported by scientific evidence. He's not a Christian researcher.
Right.
He's as secular as you can get. But he looked at it from the perspective of, I love the people in this community. 50% of them want to kill themselves? That's awful.
Yeah.
And so he researches it, and one of the conclusions he comes away with, he said, look, I'm not about the political agenda. I'm not about philosophical or moral or religious at all. I just want to look at what do the facts say.
Yeah.
And he looked at every study out there, and he said there's no evidence at all to show that people are born this way.
Yeah. I think that is excellent. In fact, if you've got those highlighted, I'd like to get those specific quotes to use.
Sure.
Now, that's scientific. We could say a lot more. There's 100 plus page article from a man who's credentialed and spent a long time, probably years, working on this.
Oh, yeah.
Now, biblically, this is what the Bible says.
Yeah.
Does the Bible say that you were born this way?
No.
Romans 1 and verse 26 talks about homosexuality and lesbianism. Romans 1:26 says, for this reason God gave them up to vile passions. It's talking about homosexuality. For even their women exchanged the natural use for that which is against nature. Notice it doesn't say they were born that way. It says they exchanged it. They chose it. Now, verse 27 says, likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men committing with men that which is shameful, and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error, which was due. Notice it says that they left the natural use of the woman. They weren't born that way. They chose to do it. The Bible is very, very blatantly specific. Women exchanged it. Men left the natural use. That is, here's something that was natural. That's how God made them. And they left that and chose to do the other. Biblically, you're not born that way. There's nothing in the Bible that says God made you that way. There's nothing in science that says God made you that way.
And in that study, he looked at is there a genetic factor? He found that none of the science supports it. He even went so long to say, is there something that happens in the embryo development? Is there something that happens, with the endocrines? Is there something with disruptors from pesticides? Or, we have all these things that have increased in the last 30 years. Is there anything there that's influencing it? And he looked through all of these things. And in his study, he essentially says that it's not genetic. He says more research needs to be done, but they did find a strong correlation between abuse. And if you think about this, whether it's, they said some studies even pointed to if you have an...
Let's ask this question before you go down that road. Okay. If there's not biblical proof you're born that way, and there's not scientific proof that you're born that way, then why are people gay? Or why do they identify in these why the LGBTQ? Why do we have all this gender identity confusion today? And you're about to list some of the things that he said.
Yeah, I had started doing research on this, I don't know, 6-8 months ago. And I had started to find bits and pieces of articles and even posts from people who were trans themselves. I remember one of the first articles I read was on Reddit, and it was a girl who said that she is biologically a female, but that she has always felt like a boy. And right before she got ready to transition, she met with a therapist, and the therapist said, do you have any childhood trauma? And she said that she completely ignored the therapist, but she herself had talked to a lot of her other friends who were in the LGBTQ community, and they had also had a lot of trauma. Now, it wasn't always sexual abuse. A lot of times it is, but sometimes it can be just, physical abuse, people that beat their kids, not discipline biblically, but abuse them, psychological, people that scream at their kids and just degrade them. And so I started following this rabbit hole, and I found another Dr. Andre von Mol, who has a super long title, but it's very qualified. And he said that basically there are these things called adverse childhood experiences, where as a child's growing, their mind is being molded, and sometimes these traumatic events will actually cause them to dissociate. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that when they are engaged in this traumatic behavior, it can take them down a road that leads them, even from a young age, to dissociate from their biological, the way God made them. It's not because God made them that way, but they experience something that leads them down a path. And so I could see how somebody who's 9 or 10 says, I didn't choose to be this way. This is just how I feel. Well, it's important in those situations to think, was there some sort of trauma that hasn't been addressed, that could have influenced that?
Yeah, when you're a teenager or you're prepubescent, you're confused. You're figuring out the world. You're learning. And if you had this very traumatic thing happen to you, you can see how I think logically we can see how that could mess someone up. There's an article on Apologetics Press website. Dr. Jeff Miller did it, and he's got some very good things in it. I will also put the link to that article so that you can look at it, because it's a very good article that he has done a lot of study on this. He lists 2 primary factors that have contributed to gender identity disorder, GID. Number 1 relates to the role of the father in the home. He says psychologist Joseph Nicolosi emphasized that, quote, in 15 years, I have spoken with hundreds of homosexual men. Perhaps there are exceptions, but I have never met a single homosexual man who had a close, loving, and respectful relationship with his father. And so he goes on and basically says it relates to the role of the father in the home. The father is instrumental in causing GID and homosexual attraction. The second thing that he says, a second major factor, relates to abuse. A 1994 report on sexual behavior in the United States revealed that sexual molestation of a child makes him 3 times more likely to identify as gay or lesbian. What does that mean? If you're sexually molested when you're very young, 3 times more likely or 4 times more likely to become a homosexual. A study that was reported in the archives of sexual behavior revealed that 60% of 882 homosexual participants said that they experienced homosexual contact when they were a child. So what does that amount to? 2 major factors: the role of the father in the home and being abused as a child.
It's funny that you say that, because in this study, I think it was 2018, it's a recent study, he said this: in both males and females, significantly higher rates of non-heterosexuality or LGBTQ homosexuality, etc., were found in participants who experienced childhood sexual abuse and in those with risky childhood family environments. And then he said in another place, one environmental factor that appears to be correlated between non-heterosexuality is child sexual abuse victimization, which may contribute to higher rates of poor mental health outcomes among non-heterosexual populations. So this one said, another quote from this study, compared to heterosexuals, non-heterosexuals are 2 to 3 times as likely to have experienced childhood sexual abuse. And then he says this, he said, essentially, this seems like a very strong cause, but we need more research.
Mm-hmm.
He said, in short, while the study suggests that sexual abuse may sometimes be a causal contributor to having a non-heterosexual orientation, more research is needed to elucidate the biological or psychological mechanisms. So what he says is there's a lot of evidence that points that this is a major cause, but more people need to look into this cause. The problem is that right now, this is not a cause that many people want to look into.
Yeah.
Because if they are to find correlation, he even says in this study, there was a lot of other very credentialed academics, professors, doctors who were involved, but they didn't want their name anywhere near this article.
Yeah.
Because they weren't as well established as Dr. McHugh and the other guy. And they were afraid that they would lose their jobs at universities. And so there needs to be more research in a field that right now with the climate, if you do studies on this, you may be penalized for finding out what truth is,
And you and I both, because we've talked about this previously, you and I both have talked to and worked with people who are homosexuals, who are trying to get their lives straight and be faithful to the Lord. And they've cited this.
Yeah.
They weren't born as homosexuals. It's a result of abuse. And so somebody might say, well, that's anecdotal, but that's what these people have personally said to us has been their experience, and it meshes with this data.
Yeah, I mean, I have had, like you said, personal stories where people coming out of that have told me about their background. It included abuse. I remember reading one story of a man, and this maybe will help people show an example of what happened. There was a man who, when he was a child, his grandmother was a seamstress, and she would make dresses, and he thought it was so cool. So the grandmother made him a purple chiffon evening dress and made this little boy wear it for, I think he said, from ages 4 to 6. And she acted like and treated him like he was this is a perverted grandma, right? Mm-hmm. But she treated him like he was a little girl. And so instead of saying, oh, why don't I teach you how to be a tailor and make men's suits? No, mm-hmm. She made him a dress. Well, the father eventually found out about, and she also, this is a big thing, parents, the grandmother said, keep this a secret from your parents. You should teach your kids, don't have any secrets between your parents and your kids.
Sure.
So the boy his grandmother puts him in this dress. He goes home. The father finds out. The father sees his little boy in a dress. The father beats him. The uncle sees this as an opportunity. Oh, this is a vulnerable kid. The uncle molests the boy. I think he was maybe 6 or 7. And what the person said, now it's a grown man, is he said that every time he thought about his genetic, his biological makeup as a male, if you're an adult, you can understand what I'm saying. Every time he thought about that part of him, it brought back those traumatic memories. And so he wanted to dissociate from it. He said, I don't want to think about myself as a boy. And so as he grew, he started to dissociate from a male to a female. And he basically became a transgender, and he transitioned until later in life, somebody pointed him to Jesus and he came back. Yeah. But that story shows you how it can happen. You have a young child who's in a very delicate place of growth, and they're learning how the world works. And they have this sick adult that is a predator, and they take advantage of this child, and it messes with the wiring in that kid's brain. And so I could see how that person, as a 10-year-old, thinks I was born this way.
Yeah.
But what a lot of the science, and this is science, anecdotes, I know people can poke holes in them.
Yeah.
When you look at the science, this large study, the largest study on this ever, he says this is a major contributing factor.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. In fact, you just triggered a thought. I was about ready to wrap it up, but let me mention this. You talked about these people molesting this young boy. There's a movement in our country, actually, for adults to have the legal right to be with younger children, isn't there?
Yeah, it's funny. My younger brother, Matt, he told me, I want to say 10 years ago, when 10 years ago in 2014, he had already told me that right now it's going to be the homosexual movement. And he told me 10 years ago, it's going to be pedophilia next. And they rebrand it. Now they call it minor attracted persons.
Yeah.
And essentially they say, hey, we're adults and we're attracted to kids. And they're trying to normalize it by changing the language.
Yeah.
And we'll wait and see. But that's the next thing that is already trying to be pushed. I think they made it maybe in California a misdemeanor.
I think in our minds, we would think there's no way. That is not going to happen. It is that we would not allow that to happen to children. And yet abortion's been legal in our country for many years. We allow that to happen. And if you think back 30 or 40 years, even when I'm 52 years old, when I was a child, if someone had told me that homosexuality and the movements we see going on today, I would have said there's no way.
Yeah.
When I joined the military in 1992, it was against the Uniform Code of Military Justice to be a homosexual. You could be kicked out or prosecuted for that. 30 years later, they celebrate it. They celebrate Pride Month. They have rainbow cakes. And we went from absolute one extreme to the other. We said it is so objectionable. This is a violation of the law to let's celebrate it and make a big deal and hold these people up as heroes in 30 years. If you apply that to the other, it is not unreasonable for me to think that the, what was the language, minor attracted persons,
MAP.
I very much see that as a plausible thing for the future.
Well, and if you think that could never happen in a civilized society, look at Rome. If you know much about ancient Rome, there's stories of the ancient Roman emperors, Nero, Caligula, these guys, and that was a common thing.
It was rampant.
Men with boys. I mean, and I think you look back at what's the cause of that, and I think that it's a symptom of the cause, which is getting away from the Bible, and the fact that the Bible has a moral standard. As soon as you move away from there being a moral standard, if you believe that we're just if we're just things in the evolutionary life cycle, why wouldn't you? I mean, if there's no real morality, then do whatever you want to do. I mean,
if you don't follow the Bible, on what basis could you even say this is wrong?
That's right. You couldn't. If you don't have a moral standard, and you don't have one in the naturalistic evolutionary, worldview.
Yeah.
If you don't have a moral standard, then what gives you the right to even say that it's wrong?
That's right.
If someone is say, well, I'm not a Christian, I'm an atheist, but I think that's wrong. Well, why? Why is anything wrong?
Yeah.
So I think you really have to get back to the Bible framework. And I think our country has gotten away from the Bible. We've been too busy with other things.
That's right.
We've been too busy with sports and entertainment, and we don't sit down and read the Bible anymore.
And in the next episode of this, I want to talk about part of how we've gotten to this point, because we still have godly people. How have godly people allowed us to get to this point? That's an important question. So we'll put a peg down there, and we will come back and visit this in the next episode. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Truth on Wheels. Until next time, be faithful.